We are beginning chapter 8. Chapter 8, I think it is. Hold on, let me double check that before I say, yeah, chapter 8, starting at 161. So, after viewing this video, hopefully you'll understand the effect of fatigue and what proper recovery has on performance. By the end of it, you should be able to recall and explain at least three fatigue mechanisms. So let's get on with it. So there's different types of fatigue. Okay, there's local fatigue, there's general, and there's chronic. As you can see in the table, local is just dealing with a specific muscle group. General is all muscle groups, and then chronic is that's something else, but it's unhealthy levels of fatigue. It's that constant tiredness and being run down kind of feeling. Okay, so there are different levels of fatigue that you need to be aware of. So causes, there are a number of reasons. The energy systems that are used, the depleted fuel stores, and the metabolic byproducts. So each of those have a different impact on fatigue. Okay, the body, after a while, it's not as good at extracting energy. Increased body temperature also has an impact on fatigue, which we'll look at a little bit later on. Dehydration and also changes in blood flow. So we will have a look at those later. So fuel depletion. All the energy systems, they use some kind of fuel to run, just like your cars, your laptops, your mobile phones, all those sort of things, okay? If they don't have fuel, then they don't run. It's as simple as that. When our fuels in our body run low, we'll still be able to, let's say, perform, but it's not going to be very, very good at all. And depending on how low they run, you may end up like this bloke down the bottom here. I forget his name, but that was the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games. You'll end up on the ground collapsed because you just don't have the energy to do, what you need to do. You might have some basic energy to, for survival needs, but you won't be able to run a marathon or anything like that. And dependent on how hard you're working will determine sort of how soon the fatigue sets in. So obviously that's what we're looking at. We're looking at fatigue. A couple of videos to hopefully explain it a little bit better and a little bit more comprehensively than what I can. So have a look at these two clips.
Just seen Callum for the last probably kilometre and a half. He's been all over the road.
These are really worrying moments for Callum Hawkins. He's just collapsed. And I think the dehydration and the weather and the savage pace he produced at the start might be getting to him. He's desperately trying to carry on here.
Callum, unfortunately, has got himself in a situation where he may not even finish.
Oh, this is such a shame for Callum
like
Hawkins.
2 kilometres
He
from
is
the finish
so
line.
brave and so talented. It is boiling hot here, just past 20 past 10 in the morning.
Well, this is where we need to be mindful here. No one in the crowd can provide any assistance at all. If they do, it'll be an automatic disqualification. The paramedics are coming in.
He is receiving treatment, so his race will be officially over now.
So that was Callum Ferguson for the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games. Obviously, the number one issue there was fatigue. Can't even see my number one. The number one issue was fatigue there. But there were a lot of other factors at play which will get explained by this bloke here from Mets.
Hey guys, Luke McElroy from Mets Performance Consulting here. Today I just wanted to quickly discuss the reason why Callum Hawkins collapsed in the marathon at the Com Games. So we've all seen it, it's all hot topic at the moment. He got along to about 40 Ks in, collapsed twice. and was unable to finish the race. So I want to speak about physiologically why that happened and what we can actually do to try to avoid that. So first and foremost, as a bit of background, obviously he's from Scotland. Not sure how many people have been over there, but it's not exactly warm weather. So he already isn't acclimatized to the environment in Gold Coast, right? So it's about 28 degrees mid-morning, got to about 30 at 12 o'clock. So it's a very hot environment. He's not used to that sort of weather, okay? So that's problem number one. Now, the reason why fatigue, we have this thing called multifactorial fatigue. So there could be a number of reasons why an athlete fatigues, particularly in an event lasting 2 hours or longer. We could talk about glycogen depletion and fuel depletion. We could talk about muscular endurance problems, but in this circumstance, the main one that we're looking at is called thermoregulation, right? So basically he got too hot. He couldn't control his core body temperature and he got too hot. So let's just run through the process of how we create heat, but most importantly, what the body will try to do to cool itself down, okay? So through the aerobic glycolysis system, we are going to create heat. We're also going to get external heat from the environment because it was a 30-degree day. So it's a double negative here. To cool the body down, we begin sweating. So what we have to do is we have to redistribute the blood from the working muscles and the non-essential organs to the surface of the skin, because what that's going to do is start to secrete our sweat glands. They're going to secrete sweat. That sweat is going to evaporate into the environment, release heat into the environment, and cool the body down. Now, the body's always going to prioritize survival over it is performance. So it might sound like a bad thing that blood's going away from the working muscles, and it is from a performance standpoint, but the body wants to sweat, it wants to cool itself down. So the body will try to maintain blood flow at the muscles as well. And the way it will do that is by increasing heart rate, which we could then result in an accumulation of lactic acid. But all we need to understand is that body wants to survive more than it does want to perform, okay? When we sweat, we lose blood from blood plasma, okay? So the blood's made up of multiple components. We have what we call hematocrit, and we have what's called blood plasma, okay? So the hematocrit's all the stuff in the blood. We're looking at your red blood cells, your white blood cells, your platelets.
He should have actually said water back there when he was talking about what we lose from our sweat. So we actually lose water from our sweat, not blood from our blood, I think it was.
All the stuff in the blood. The red blood cells obviously carry oxygen. For most people, about 45% of the blood is made up of hematocrit, all the stuff. The other 55% is made up of what we call blood plasma. So blood plasma is fluid and enzymes, okay? It's really important, but it's the fluid in the blood. So 90% of the blood plasma is made of fluid. When we sweat, we lose out the blood plasma. Okay, when we lose blood plasma through dehydration, because that's where we sweat it from, we get an increase in what we call blood viscosity. So viscosity just means thickness. So we get thicker blood. If we have less fluid in the blood and more stuff, it's going to get thicker. It's going to get harder to circulate. So that's what's happening towards the back end of this race. When we have less blood, our stroke volume is going to decrease. So stroke volume being the amount of blood we're ejecting out of that left ventricle of the heart per beat, that's going to decrease. The reason it will decrease is because we have less total blood volume. If less blood comes back to the heart, less blood is going to leave the heart. That makes sense. It's harder to do. The body will try to compensate with this decreased stroke volume by increasing heart rate. Because if we can't get as much blood per beat, we're going to beat faster in an attempt to try to maintain what we call cardiac output, so maintain our oxygen circulation. The problem is, however, when our blood becomes so thick because we've lost all the fluid, the body is actually going to stop sweating at some point. Because if we keep sweating, the body is going to, we're not going to be able to circulate the blood. It's going to be so viscous, so thick that we physically can't circulate the blood, so we're going to have a heart attack or have a stroke. Again, the body does not want to do that. It's always going to prioritize survival over performance. So we're going to stop sweating. The second we stop sweating, as you can imagine, our core body temperature is going to skyrocket because we lose 70% of our heat through evaporative cooling, through sweating. So if we can't sweat, we're going to heat up very, very quickly. And when our body temperature gets above that 37 degrees, gets into that 41, 42, we call that obviously heat exhaustion, and that's where we're in big trouble. So this is where central fatigue comes in. This is all peripheral fatigue. This is happening outside the central nervous system. This is happening inside the central nervous system. If we hit 43 degrees, we're dead. That's it. Enzymes are denatured and we're going to die. So as soon as we get into the 40s, that's serious alarm bells ringing. And what happens is we get central fatigue. So literally what happens is the brain will stop sending signals to the muscles. All right. So we're actually going to get less motor signals to the muscles, We'll see the coordination. Obviously, Callum was really struggling with his coordination, and it's all to do with central fatigue. So again, it doesn't want to die, so we're going to physically stop sending signals to the muscles, and we're going to collapse and we're going to fall over, okay? It also makes sense that through stroke volume that we're going to have low blood pressure too. Because if we have less blood circulating, less pressure, we're going to get dizzy because we can't get as much blood around the body because we don't have as much total blood volume, okay? So what does this all mean? Obviously, we saw that he collapsed, but from how we can avoid that, from the point of view of avoiding it, it's all to do with acclimatization, okay? So obviously, we already said that he was from Scotland, so very cold, not used to the hot environment. So what acclimatization involves, it's all to do with coming over and exercising and training in the environment that you're going to be competing at, okay? So the general recommendation is 14 days at the environment, 3 times a week at 50% VO2 max at least for 1 to 2 hours in duration. So what he could have done, to an extent other than drinking more fluid, pouring fluid on him, he could have come over to the environment for at least 2 weeks while training, not just tapering. You can't just sit on the beach and acclimatise, you have to actually properly train. And what that's going to do is it will increase our sweat rate, it will decrease the amount of sodium we lose, so we're going to be better at cooling our body down, but we're not going to lose all the electrolytes, which is really important in muscular contraction. So, fairly complicated process, but as a quick summary, we get hot, we dehydrate, our blood becomes viscous, it's harder to circulate, we're going to stop sweating because we don't want to die. As a result, our core body temperature increases, we get central fatigue, our brain takes over, our nervous system takes over, we shut off the signals to the legs, we have low blood pressure, we get dizzy, we fall over, we collapse, we can't continue. Okay, so that's pretty much the gist of it. Multifactorial fatigue, it's often more than one thing. So hopefully you enjoyed that, guys. Any questions, let us know. More content, get into the Mets Mastermind, and we'll speak to you soon.
I hope that made sense. I mean, when you look at it all in the big picture and you stop and think about it, it does all, you know, sort of match up and make sense. So we've discussed this in the past, the glycogen versus fats, food fuel conundrum. It's a significant factor in any activity that is over 60 minutes in duration, and the reason being is because carbohydrates, they get used during maximal and submaximal activities because they're so easy to break down when you compare them to fats. The carbohydrates, they break down easily, they require less oxygen, and it happens a lot quicker, whereas the fats takes more time, takes more energy, and it's just a lot slower. But the trade-off is that you get heaps more ATP from the breakdown of fat. So where does all of the glycogen comes from? Well, we get it from the muscle, we get it from the liver. Then there's glucose that's stored in the blood. Ideally, what we'd like to do is we'd like to train our body to predominantly work using our triglyceride stores before moving on to the carbohydrates. So the idea is that we would use the fats for the majority of the marathon, and then, you know, towards the end of the race where we need to step it from this level up to, you know, this level, we could then use our glycogen stores because they require less oxygen, which means the oxygen that is being breathed in can go, you know, to breaking down the carbohydrates, and it doesn't rely solely on, our performance doesn't have to suffer as a result because we're trying to break down the fat. So if we were to, you know, if the body was to, I guess, run out of the glycogen stores and we're having to break down our fats, the fat stores to provide us with that energy, our performance is going to suffer. We're going to have to slow down to a lower rate, and it's not good. So in terms of like how fast is it delivered, we're looking at, you know, between a 50 to 100% sort of gains versus the carbohydrates versus fat. So there is a big difference, which is why a lot of athletes will, carb load. They will train themselves, train their bodies to use the fat stores earlier on in the race. So then when the intensity does increase, that oxygen that's being breathed in can be used for the breaking down, and also providing that energy, or sorry, the oxygen that we need to progress to the end of the race. Metabolic byproducts. So this is all the trash. The two anaerobic systems, they are the ones that accumulate the most in terms of like the byproducts. Okay, the ATP PC is actually pretty good. It doesn't produce any sort of performance inhibiting byproducts, whereas the anaerobic glycolysis system, that's the big one. That's the one that produces that performance inhibiting waste. It's usually associated with the high intensity work, and where you don't get a lot of recovery times. And generally what is being talked about, and there is a giant, well, it's not really a giant moth, but there's a moth flying in front of my camera. Go away. So yeah, most commonly we would talk about the lactate and the hydrogen ions, or H+. So what happens is it causes the muscular contractions to stop. It changes the pH levels of the blood, and it's most commonly associated with that burning and that really unpleasant feeling within the legs, the arms, whatever it might be. We're constantly producing the lactate, but because of the nature of activity and the intensity, the body's able to remove it. So if you think back to that lactate inflection point, so if we had to draw our graph again, and we had these marks along the way, it's relatively consistent all the way along, and then we start exercising anaerobically, and what happens is there's a massive spike. So our lactate inflection point, and that is a really bad line. I just can't draw straight lines to save myself. It's that point there where it starts to increase exponentially, and just that upward sort of trend. That is the lactate inflection point. Let's just put that there. I should be doing this on my other computer, but this one's better. So that's the LIP. You should know that term. So basically what happens is, and I mean, you don't need to know it in this sort of detail, but by preventing the secretion of calcium that helps with the filaments to I guess bond to those the muscle fibers, it prevents that attachment, and that's why you get that weakness in the muscle fibers. So that sliding filament theory, so the H bands, the I bands and the A band, they can't slide anymore, and I mean essentially that's what muscular contraction is. So the aerobic pathway in fatigue is the aerobic system is pretty cool, because the byproducts that are produced, they don't actually inhibit the performance. I mean, you've got CO2, you've got heat, and then what's the other one that you've got? It's H2O. So none of those actually produce any sort of performance inhibiting waste products. And you could argue that heat is going to inhibit performance, but it's not yeah, no, it's not. So in terms of like fatigue and that, the carbohydrates, the fats, they're used as energy. They don't produce a great deal of lactic acid, and I'm getting cramp in my leg. For extended activity, so the ones that go longer than an hour, fats are generally used as a fuel. And what will happen is, because it requires more oxygen, I think we discussed this in the previous slide, because it requires more oxygen to break the fats down to provide the energy, performance has got to go from, you know, this level down to this level. So that can obviously be an issue. Fatigue, it's generally caused by depleted fuel stores, dehydration, increased body temperature. So again, you could argue that heat is a performance inhibiting byproduct. And then you've also got your physical and mental stress. So this is why athletes will follow these strict diets, and they'll prepare for these sort of events by carb loading prior to the actual event, so that they can try and, you know, decrease that risk of fatigue and running out of fuel stores. So the redistribution of blood. Obviously, we've looked at like the acute responses to exercise, and you've seen that, you know, there's been an increased demand for oxygen and so on and so forth, which means that we need an increased supply of blood. And we know that the blood gets redistributed from all the other organs to the skeletal muscles because they're the ones that are working. I've got a little video which I reckon is pretty cool, which will hopefully explain it, which, if it works, fingers crossed.
Using this graph, we're going to compare the relative distribution of blood at rest and during exercise. Firstly, we can see if we look at the brain that the blood flow to the brain remains the same whether you're at rest or undergoing exercise. However, in comparison to this, blood flow to the heart, the muscles and the skin is all increased during exercise as compared to when you are at rest. In contrast to this, blood flow to the kidneys, stomach, intestines and other abdominal organs is reduced during exercise.
So you can see there the difference. The graph that is on the other page, that illustrates it as well, but you can see that there's a difference between, you know, what is actually happening. I mean, it's not a, let's say, it's not a proper graph, but you get the idea. The majority of the blood, instead of at rest being distributed relatively evenly, it goes from, you know, the kidneys, the stomach, the intestines, it all gets distributed to the working muscles. And like we saw the other day with the marathon runner, his body had basically begun to shut down. It was going to protect itself, so it kept blood flowing to the brain and the heart, but, you know, all the other vital organs and that sort of thing, just, yeah, the muscles, it distributed the blood away from the muscles because it wanted to survive. So, you know, if we look at the two columns there, we've got, you know, the body's response to exercise. So we need more oxygen, we have more waste products, we have blood volume, more of it going to the muscles. There's an increase in the cardiac output. There's less blood flow to the vital organs and more to the working muscles. It'll also cause an increase in core temperature because there's, you know, the chemical reactions and the muscles working and that sort of stuff. So the body has to, I guess, monitor and keep an eye on its temperature. It doesn't want to get too hot, it doesn't want to get too cool. So if there is a temperature increase, then we'll have that vasodilation happening, where the blood is sent from, you know, working muscles to the surface of the skin. and it means that our performance is going to be inhibited, and as a result we may produce lactic acid. So what is, some of the performance inhibiting things? Dehydration is a big one. So sweat is water, okay, but there's salt, there's electrolytes. I'm sure we've all tasted our sweat at some point. Come on, you'd be lying if you said you hadn't. So like in that previous video, the blood is made up, like 55% of the blood is plasma, and of that, almost 95% of that is water. So it keeps the blood fluid. If we sweat too much, then we're losing the water out of the body. We're dehydrating ourselves. The blood becomes thicker, and as a result, the body has to work harder to produce, to move that same amount of blood around the body. So, reasons why people might become dehydrated is because they haven't had enough fluids while they're competing, not drinking enough while they're exercising. It can cause a whole heap of health issues and, possibly lead to death. Time for the chapter check questions. Page 174. That's not good. There should be a space in between that. That's going to bug me. I'll go and change that. Also, scratch that. I don't want you to do the review questions just yet, so I'm going to go back in. I'm going to change that too. These are the questions that I want you to do. I don't want you to worry about doing this one. That's a bad line. Let's get rid of that one. Let's try again. Do it properly. All right, there we go. So I just want you to do question 2, question 3, 4, and 5. Okay.